We'll also see that there's a difference between the Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud, which we don't speak about we don't speak about a lot, but now, thank God, we're doing the JLI. So this Sunday we're going to talk a little bit about the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. But here you'll see a difference in the law between about how to become a guarantor between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, which is basically the philosophy that or the spirituality, the difference between the spirituality in Israel and in Babylonia. And if we have time when we get to the end, we get to the discussion of um, the three tractates in the Talmud that talk about torts and managing monetary law, Baba Kama, Baba Mitzvah, Baba Bakrat, first gate, second gate, and third gate. Sorry, first gate, middle gate, and final gate, which is basically all of it comes from this week's parsha. So the Hasidic commentary looks at this and says, what is the spiritual meaning of the way these Mishnahs, the way the Talmud is organized, and how studying the law is really advancing in the spiritual development of the person. So that's tall order, but I think in a few minutes, I think we can at least get in and get into this stuff and see what's taking place. But to do this, to really appreciate this, we want to take a few minutes to talk about the law. And once you talk about the law and you get a little bit detailed in the law, then the Hasidic light comes and shows how every detail of the law also has a spiritual counterpart, but you have to see the law to be able to appreciate it. So the law itself is interesting. It's not too intricate. It's interesting. You could even do it on a Friday morning and even without a second coffee. But it's and then we're going to get to the spiritual side, which is also absolutely fascinating. So that is what I'm thinking, but I would like to hear if you guys want to talk about something else or direct in a different direction or whatever is on your mind in connection to this parsha, I would love to hear. Otherwise, we proceed.
Take it away, Rabbi.
Okay, good. Okay, let me find this talk of the Rebbe, so I'm not telling you just things that are not accurate. Translation into English. Look at that. I'll also translate it into Hebrew because why not? Hebrew's good too.
While you're looking, Rabbi, do you want to just mention, and I've heard many thoughts on it, the juxtaposition of the Ten Commandments to all these various mishpatim laws, the torts?
Yeah, so that's important conversation. For the first time, I mean, we're always going around this, but this week I found a very nice formulation that captures everything you could say. And what I would say is, it's not mine, so I'm not going to take the credit for it. What I would say is God is in the details. In other words, you read the Ten Commandments, not just Ten Commandments, but also the revelation that occurred simultaneous to the Ten Commandments. All the people saw the fire and the smoke and the pillars of fire and the smoke and the sound of the shofar, as we discussed last week at length. And you have this extraordinary experience. And then what do we hear? What's the next step? Where do we go from here? Where we go from here is God cares about how you treat your neighbor, how you treat the weak, how you treat the servant, et cetera, et cetera. So God is in the details. And again, this is in a way unique to Judaism because most religions and spiritual traditions are trying to transcend and trying to say, how do we leave the mundane and how do we try to become close to the infinite? And what Judaism is telling us, we're in the placing of mishpatim, both before, right after the Ten Commandments, but also technically it sandwiches it in between because we go back to the Ten Commandments. So this is literally, we go to the preparation of Sinai. So it's sandwiched between Sinai is that for Judaism, yes, there's the big ideas. Yes, there's the theology, the present understanding and believing in the one God, connecting to God, big ideas. But the big ideas are really meaningless if they're not going to play out in the civil law. If it's not going to play out in how you treat your neighbor. If it's not going to play out in how you do business. So I think that's something about the juxtaposition of the monetary law and the details of the civil law and laws of torts when we're talking about right after Sinai. Right after Sinai, that's what's important. That if my ox scores your cow, I owe you money. Yes, that is what's important because God cares about the details. And that's a big idea because it's a radical idea because most people thought God doesn't care about the details. In fact, today most people think that God doesn't care about the details. Judaism insists that God does, but it's very hard to wrap your brain around. It remains hard to wrap your brain around that the infinite God cares about how I do business with a fellow, what I eat, what I do. It's a very difficult thing for people to comprehend because infinity means God is infinite. So how could something infinite care about something so specific? So the Hasidic answer or the Kabbalistic answer, the philosophical answer is that God is not infinite because infinity is already a definition. If you say he's infinite and he cannot express himself in the finite space, you are limiting him. So we don't define God as infinite. We define God as the Kabbalists say, Shleimuta dekula. He has all qualities. Anything that's a quality he has. And expressing himself in infinity is a quality, he has that. And the ability to express himself in the finite space is also a quality, and he has that as well. So you can't define him as infinite because infinity is also a box. If you say he's so infinite he can't come into the finite space, you're locking him in a box. It's a big box. It's an infinitely big box, but it's still a box, and God doesn't fit into any boxes. So by placing the laws of the monetary law right after the Ten Commandments, right after the Revelation, we say, Sinai, you want to experience Sinai? Make sure that you're treating your neighbor and you're doing business and you're very careful in how you interact with the people around you.
But is that so different from other religions where, I mean, the details, the devil is in the details, and the details really lead to a moral character. And I think Catholicism and Buddhism and others really regard moral upbringing of a soul very important, no?
I agree. I'm not, so let me clarify. First of all, I'm not an expert in other religions, but I would say as like this, I would say that the question is where do you find the infinity? Not how do you develop your character? Where do you find infinity? Where do you find transcendence? Right? Yes, you have to be ethical because that's what God wants. It's important. But where do you find the transcendence? And I think that religions as a whole, maybe there's exceptions, but as a whole, the religious experience is one of transcendence. Even when you talk about you have to be in the world, that's a concession, right? And that's why that say other faiths would say, certain faiths would say, it's better not to marry, and the priest shouldn't marry. And if you have to marry, that's a concession to human nature. And what does Judaism say about specifically that question? The high priest on Yom Kippur, a high priest who is not married cannot go into the Holy of Holies. He cannot represent the people because he's not married, he's incomplete. Right? So the notion, of course, every religion is saying you have to be ethical, but the question is, that's not the question. The question is, where do you find the infinity? Where do you find God? Where do you find the essence? And religions are usually in a place of transcendence. You want to go to nature. You want to escape. You want to climb the Himalaya. You want to go away from the distraction. And what Judaism is saying, by placing these laws specifically right after the Ten Commandments, and like I said, sandwiched between the revelation at Sinai, and then after we speak about the civil law, we go back and talk about the revelation at Sinai, even though it's out of order. So it's clear we're sandwiching this in between Sinai. And we're saying, you want to feel Sinai? You want to feel the infinity of God? Specifically in the details, specifically in how you treat other people, specifically in detailed monetary law. So yes, every religion is going to say God wants you to be moral, but we're saying that is the space where you get the revelation of Sinai. That's the space where you touch the infinity. Now, when I said I said also philosophers have this problem. Philosophers, even the philosophers who believed in God, Aristotle, etc., they have this problem of they feel that God doesn't care enough about what we do. So if you have to be moral, it's just for the benefit of society, for the benefit of humanity, because the mind obligates us to do so, because philosophy obligates us to do so. But they would never believe that God, who's infinite, cares about the people. That would be an offense to God. How could you say God cares about something so minuscule? And if I say that God does, they would say you're offending God. And Judaism says, no, if you think God only cares about infinity, you're putting God in a box. in the box of infinity. But God is not, in any box. He's not finite, he's not infinite. He's neither, and he's both.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. John, please.
Rabbi, as people were crafting these laws, and you very frequently talk about the ego versus the soul. The soul, it's the part of us that's connected to God. The ego, that's the part of us connected to our own instincts. Were these scholars, these rabbis, these leaders asking themselves always, as they thought about something as concrete as my ox goring your ox, were they asking themselves, how does God feel about this? Was that in the forefront of their attempt to answer the question?
For sure. That's the idea that our civil law is based on the verses in this parsha. So it has a divine foundation. And that's why it is very interesting to note that even though we call this parsha Mishpatim, which Mishpatim specifically means ordinances, but more specifically means laws that are logical. In almost every category of law, there are some laws that are illogical. And I wouldn't say illogical, they're counterintuitive. And we only say them because the Torah says so. And then that forces you to start thinking about, why did God say this? I can give you 100 examples. I'll give you one from this parsha. Okay? So the parsha has a law, and the law says that if you dig a pit in the street and someone falls in the pit, you are responsible. Okay. But the Torah says, so the person who dug the pit is responsible. Torah says, so if someone digs a pit, and then v'nafal shama, what falls into the pit falls in a shor or chamor, an ox or a donkey. So the question is, why I have to say ox and donkey? If you say one example is just an example. That's okay. When the Torah says my ox scores your ox, it doesn't mean ox. It means any animal. Torah brings an example. It's no problem. But two examples is already a problem. That's the way Talmudic logic works, right? If it's one example, it's one example. But if it's two examples, then it's not an example. So it's specific. So it's an extra word. So the Talmud teaches that, you know something? The Torah is here telling us, without getting into the specifics, but the bottom line takeaway teaching is that if I dig a pit and someone falls into the pit, it's only an animal, but it's not a human being. If someone else falls into the pit, I do not have to pay for that. Now that is very counterintuitive. And it forces us to sit and figure out, what is the Torah signaling us? What is the Torah telling us about this? And I can get into that. But that's an example that, even though technically, yes, this is logical law. If you dig a pit, you're responsible. But if you get into the details, you'll see the question is really, what is the divine law? This is not a system that would match up exactly with a system that logic will produce. So the answer to your question,
I find this confusing in the following way, and maybe I missed what you just said. If a human being falls into the pit, they're responsible?
The person who dug the pit is not responsible to pay.
Fine. So, Rabbi, if I build a swimming pool and somebody falls into the pool and drowns, are you telling me they're responsible? Because in Connecticut, I'm responsible.
It depends. It always depends on the circumstances. And if it's the children, and there's a separate law that you can't put dangerous things in your house. So there's all kinds of things. But yes, you touched upon this. Maybe the Torah is signaling to you that there is a responsibility of a person not to cause damage, but there's also a responsibility of a person not to fall into a pit. When you're walking down the street, don't look at your phone. You know, today, nobody's even looking, right? So you assume that the guy is walking into the street. If you're driving or if you're you assume the guy's not looking. So the Torah says, yes, I'm responsible for my actions. So if I dig a pit and someone's animal falls in, animals are not as intelligent, don't have the animals are not as responsible as human being. So I have to pay. But the Torah is limiting the liability of the guy who dug the pit. And if someone else falls in, the person is not liable to pay damages. And the question is, why not? That's a very interesting thing. I would think the opposite. In this country, if I trip in your house, I'll sue you, no problem. Or I trip on the street in front of your house, I'll sue you, no problem. Right? So the Torah is similar. On one hand, it's similar to the civil law, but on the other hand, the Torah is saying something a little bit different. So what's it signaling? So maybe it's signaling that we talked about this on Tuesday a little bit, is that freedom is responsibility. And I have a responsibility not to cause damage to other people. The other person has a responsibility not to damage, not to allow himself to be damaged, right? So there's something here. It's not just, oh, you did the pit, so I'm allowed to crash into, you dig a pit, so I'm allowed to fall into a pit. No, it's a shared responsibility. So these are examples where, even though technically when you read the Torah, it sounds like almost copy and paste from the common law in the Near East at the time, once you pull out your magnifying glass, and certainly when you talk about the way the sages deduce laws from these verses, what emerges is a completely different story. And what emerges is a law that is much more in tune with the question that you asked: what does God say in this case, and what values and what responsibility is God signaling to us, and how do we share responsibility, and how do we share the public space, etc.
Rabbi, is there a lot of talk in Torah about the distinction between responsibility and guilt? Keep in mind that in my line of work, guilt often is the source of a lot of misery.
Yeah.
Responsibility is the source of a lot of mental health. So
Yeah.
does
So
Torah talk extensively about?
There's a lot of talk about that. I don't want to talk without preparing and thinking about this, but because there's so much talk about it. This the basic question of, if my animal gores your animal, I have to pay. What is the philosophical underpinnings of that law? So my animal gored, is it because I'm guilty, meaning I should have protected the animal and I didn't, so I am guilty and I have to pay because I am guilty? That's one school of thought, that one option that you have to scrutinize and see if the Talmud and the Torah is consistent with that. So that's one perspective. The other perspective is, no, I'm not guilty. There's absolutely no guilt here. It's just that if my assets damage, then my assets are liable. So in other words, it's a question of liability without guilt. And not always is liability connected with guilt. Some cases it is, some cases it's not. But it's not necessarily so. So there could be a separation between liability and guilt, and I am liable even though I'm not guilty. That's one way to look at it. So in general, that when you, even before you open up the tractate in the Talmud of Baba Kama, the first gate that talks about Torah, it's the first thing that in yeshiva they're going to discuss is who, first of all, is there it gets even more general. Is there an obligation not to cause damage, or is it just a compensation? In other words, is there a mitzvah to guard my ox, or just if my ox gores you, I have to pay? So is it a prohibition, or is it just monetary compensation? Question one. Question two is what you mentioned: is what is the reason that I have to pay? Under what a legal theory? So one legal theory is guilt. And the other legal theory is it's got nothing to do with guilt. It's your mammon, it's your money, it's your assets. If your assets cause damage, you are liable, even if you had no responsibility. Because remember, in the ancient world, if I had a field, I had to have a bunch of oxen to plow the field. There's no way in the world I can hire an employee to watch every ox. There would be no economy. There would be nothing happening. So that's the question. In every case, we have to evaluate how much liability, how much guilt, how much. And that's what we're grappling with. Yes. Okay. For me, this is a lot of fun. I love this stuff. I eat this stuff up. I hope I'm going to be able to convey it in a way that is interesting, because I want to do justice to this, but it's really beautiful. And what I like about this is that we start from a point that's very legal, and we get to a point that's very spiritual and tells us about our relationship with each other and our community. And it also touches upon the difference between Jewish people as they're living in Israel and as they're living in diaspora, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, which is of course very relevant to what's happening today and yesterday and tomorrow. So it takes, what does it mean to be a Jew in Israel? What does it mean to be a Jew in diaspora? How connected we are to each other. So there's so much here. We really could talk about this essay for hours. And this is not an exaggeration. I'm going to try to do it in 35 minutes, or not do it, but touch upon it. Okay, so here's a scenario. Scenario is, if you don't mind, like in yeshiva, we always talk about, you have to say a name to keep track of what's happening here. So Reuven borrows money from Shimon. That's okay. So I'm going to say I'm going to borrow money. So if anyone here doesn't mind to say that I'm going to borrow money from you, if you don't mind, if I use you as an example, let me know. So I could say you. There was yeah, doctor. I could say you. I could say I borrowed money from. Okay.
Rabbi, you can always borrow money from me.
Okay. So there's an old joke that the guy says, I've been in yeshiva for 10 years. And what I learned is that someone named Reuven should not borrow money from someone named Shimon. That's all I learned. Because every case is what happens if Reuven borrows from Shimon and forgets to pay back. So that's the joke. I says, I was in yeshiva for 10 years. Reuven shouldn't borrow. Okay. So I borrow money from Dr. John. I say, can I borrow $100? You say, no problem. Then you say, but you want a guarantor. So Vicky says, Vicky, you mind if I use your name? I'm going to be kind. I'm going to be, you're kind. Vicky says,
anytime.
Vicky's going to be the guarantor. Look how kind she is. She doesn't mind. She'll be the guarantor. The problem is that she didn't sign anything. But she said her verbal contract. She said she's gonna be a guarantor. What's the law? The law is that Vicky is legally a guarantor. If I cannot pay back, Dr. John can go to Vicky and get the money back. Why? How could you have an obligation? I'm obligated to repay the doctor because the doctor gave me $100, so I have to return it. But Vicky did not get anything. So you need in common law they call it what do they call it again? If it skips my mind, they call it consideration. You have to get something to give something to give a legal obligation. So Vicky didn't really get anything. So why is she liable? So the answer is, to simplify, the answer is Vicky got a lot. By her word, Dr. John wrote a $100 check. Right? So look what she got. Her power of her word is that the doctor gave me money. So based on her word, doctor gave me money based on Vicky's word. So that is a benefit that Vicky gets, and therefore she obligates herself. And therefore now Vicky is the guarantor. Give me just 1 second. So
Wait, see, Vicky has shown up now.
Yeah, we're talking about money. She's
Rabbi,
Okay, I have a question.
Rabbi, let's make it a little more realistic. You
Yeah.
borrowed $100,000 from me. Now because let's face it, for $100, I'd say forget it.
100 million, 100. It doesn't matter.
Let's make it a little more realistic.
100,000. Fine. So Vicky says, so I say 100,000. Vicky says, doctor says he needs a guarantor. Vicky says she'll be the guarantor. She didn't write.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The six horizon. So I want to know if I need to prove my credibility.
So one second. Let's assume here that nobody argues with any of the facts. If later Vicky says, I never agreed to be a guarantor, then it's a different question. But let's agree we all agree about the facts. The doctor trusts Vicky. He thinks Vicky, either she has money or she has access to money or she could raise money. Doesn't really matter. But we're all on the same page. The facts of this question are not in dispute. We all agree that's exactly what happened. I went to the doctor. Doctor said, I'll give you 100,000 if Vicky is the guarantor. Vicky said yes verbally. She's liable to be a guarantor. It means if I can pay, if I don't have assets, they go to Vicky. But why? What did she get? The answer is, what do you mean what she got? By her word, she got someone to write a check. Oh, that's power. That's empowering. So that benefit, you got someone to write a check. So now you're on the line. Okay. But let me just contrast that to the next case, and that's why you'll see the difference. What's the next case? Case 2. Case 2 is a little bit different. Case 2 is, I come to Dr. John and I say, Dr. John, can I have $100,000? You say, sure, no problem. Pay me back in a month. A month later, I don't have any money. So now we're in shul, and the doctor, you come to me in the morning, I'm middle of davening, and you say, give me my $100,000. What's going on? I need my money. So Vicky says, give the guy a break. Let him have another month. And if he doesn't pay you back, I'll be the guarantor. In other words, Vicky is basically trying to say, stop. In the language of the Talmud, the creditor is choking the guy in the market. I'm in the market. I'm trying to do business. You come to me and start shouting, give me the $100,000. So Vicky says, Go take a hike, go away, come back in a month. And if the guy doesn't pay you, I'll pay you. Now, dun, 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 now the question says, so what happens? Vicky now, if she writes a contract, of course she's liable to be the guarantor. If she makes a formal act of acquisition, of course she's liable. She made a formal act of acquisition. But here she said nothing. All she did is she spoke. So here comes the very interesting dispute. The Babylonian Talmud says Vicky is not responsible. She does not the guarantor. The doctor gave me an extra month. It's your problem. Why? What did Vicky get? She got nothing. In case A, what did Vicky get? Because on her mouth, the doctor wrote a check. Ooh, that's important. But on the second thing, what did she do? She told the guy, give the guy a break. You know, she didn't get anything. It's not substantial enough. That is Babylonian Talmud. Jerusalem Talmud says, no, 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 no. Jerusalem Talmud says, Vicky is liable. That's a dispute between the two Talmuds. Now, once we figure this out, we could discuss it. Then we'll get to the spiritual concepts behind this, which is fascinating. But that's the two cases. So that's what I said. In case one, what the consideration that Vicky's getting, you have to get something to be able to give, unless you obligate yourself by making a contract or whatever. But if the doctor gives me money, I'm liable to pay. Vicky is the guarantor. She didn't get anything. So why does she have? Why is she liable? She's liable because in case A, because she based on her word, the doctor wrote a check and gave money based on her word. That's substantial. The question is the second case. Nobody gave money because of her. She's just trying to be nice. She feels bad for me, so she tells the doctor, "Go have a nice day. I'll pay you if you need." So here, there's a dispute between the two Talmuds, and this is where the fun begins. And if there's a dispute, you have to see what's the root of the dispute, and the fun begins. Go ahead, Dr. Bob.
Just a question. Remember when we were discussing about the Meraglim, and the sin really was not that, the sin is that they wanted to stay in the desert and kind of daven and be in that kind of nirvana and not, isn't this kind of Hillel Shammai Jerusalem Babylonian, isn't this kind of a return to the wilderness, breaking teeth on minutia, where
No,
there's no real answer in the end anyway?
No. There are real answers. There are real answers. I would say the opposite. I would say this is the exact opposite, because this is, we want to figure out how to operate a real economy. We're not sitting in the desert thinking about ideas. This is a real question. These are real scenarios. You remember today you need money, you go to the ATM. You need money, you have a credit card, okay? In the olden days, there's no banking system. So your assets were your field, but the potatoes didn't grow yet. So if I really wanted to buy milk, I have to borrow money from my neighbor. So these questions of borrowing is really the foundation of not just an economy, but even a society. So if you want to figure out, if you want a functioning society and a functioning economy, you have to make sure that the credit is flowing, even today, but also today, right? Today, I'm old enough to remember the crash in 2008, credit freeze. The Talmud goes out of its way to make sure no credit freezes, because all kinds of laws to protect the creditor, because we have to have money flowing through the economy. We have to have a proper system of loans to be able to flow through. Now, part of that is the institution of a guarantor, because a guarantor is critical for that institution, because it's not like today where the bank could come and easily figure out what your assets are, etc. So you need guarantors. So this institution is so important. But the point is, when we're talking about this is not about theoretical. This is not about let's sit and philosophize. This is about how do we create a functioning economy. I would say this is the opposite of the spies. Now,
but understood. You had the Jerusalem and Babylonian, which were at odds. So
so what happens?
Is Vicky on the hook or not?
So it depends where you live. Right now, the law is going to be, we follow the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. Vicky is not on the hook. In case B, in case A, she's on the hook. In case B, she's not on the hook. Had you been living in Israel in times of the Jerusalem Talmud, she would be on the hook. Why is this important? It's not a really disagreement. Let me just explain why it's not a disagreement. When it comes to obligation, it comes to contract law, even in civil law, in American law, common law, you have the concept of the meeting of the minds. What was the intention of Vicky? There's a question, what did Vicky really mean to do? Did Vicky really mean to obligate herself? And if she didn't, then maybe she's not liable. So what we're really getting at is there's the practical decision, which is if you live in today's world, we follow the Babylonian Talmud, which would say that Vicky is not liable in case two. In other words, if the doctor gave money based on her word, then she's liable. But if the doctor did not give money based on her word, it's just that he was pressing me for repayment, and she said, "Leave him alone. I'll be the guarantor." That is not. She did not get anything substantial enough, so therefore she's not liable. So that's the law, and now we understand how creditors work and how the economy works, and that's why we're here, because we need to make sure we have a functioning economy. The next step is to take the psychology. What exactly happens? Why does Vicky obligate herself? Why not? What does that tell us about community? What does it tell us how to build community, and not just build an economy, but also build a community? So that's step one.
I have one other question too. Is there a difference between verbal and written? Because we're not talking about anything in writing here.
Correct.
And
Yes.
is there a sense
Right.
that somehow your words mean a lot more, perhaps in both these spheres, than they do now? Because basically now, how much is your word your bond, or does it have to be in writing?
So again, I'm not an expert on the American law, but in general, you could have a verbal contract. The problem would be what happens if there's denial, right? But this case, there's no denial. So this case is simple. Nobody is denying it. We all agree on the facts. Vicky agrees on the facts. We all agree on the facts. The question is, what is the significance of the facts? And but what? Yes. So the point here is the point is the question. These questions are questions how to create an economy, how to build community. I'll tell you a story that I heard at my grandfather's shiva, and I think it's a fascinating story. I don't know if it's a true story because you'll see in a minute why I don't know if it's true. It's just an assumption, but this is the story. So my grandfather had a neighbor, and my grandfather, the neighbor comes and says, he says a story. They're living on that block at least for 30 years together, neighbors. So the neighbor says like this. The neighbor says that often people would come to my grandfather for loans. And every single time my grandfather would go and tell the person, go next door and go ask the guy next door to be the guarantor. And the guy next door was known to have money, access to money. We could check him up. His name is Baimel Green, Shia Baimel Green. At some point, I thought he'd be a billionaire. Then he lost money because of the crash. Whatever the case is, this is a well-known figure. So my grandfather said, go to Shia Baimel Green, and he will give you, and to ask him to be the guarantor. And lo and behold, this guy, Shia Baimel Green, says, I always said yes, no problem whatsoever. Why? Because my grandfather never, ever came to him to ask him to pay up the BNB and guarantor, ever, over decades. So obviously not everybody was paying back, but my grandfather never went collecting from the guarantor. So Shia Baimel Green is sitting at the shiv, and he says, so why did Shmuel Isaac, my grandfather, why did he always send the guy to Shia Baimel Green? And then he says he thinks the reason is as follows. He thinks the reason is it wasn't about being a guarantor. It was about somebody witnessing the transaction. And my grandfather didn't want to make the guy feel bad and say, write a document so I prove that you're not going to lie. So instead of doing that, he said, go to the neighbor, ask the neighbor to be a guarantor. And that's how he had a witness. So it wasn't ever about the guarantor, it was about the witness. And he said, for decades, he never came back to me, never asked me to be the guarantor. But the person borrowing money knew that you can't deny it because somebody saw it. All I'm trying to say is that the concept of the guarantor really does, the institution, in other words, this is important. It's important then, it's important today. So today it's your bank manager. If you live in a tight-knit community, it would be you can go to your neighbor. But the bottom line is you cannot have an economy where you don't have credit. So today you have the credit card companies or whatever, or your bank, whatever it is. But this is critical to a functioning society. That's what we're trying to get at. Okay, so let's get to the philosophical point, and then we could see, maybe we can read it inside and think about this for a minute. Obviously, the Jerusalem Talmud, the opinion that says that Vicky is liable, even if she did not cause the doctor to write a check. In other words, just by verbally, she really got very little. She really got very little in return. So the Babylonian Talmud says case 2, Vicky is not liable. Jerusalem Talmud says case 2, Vicky is liable. Obviously, in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Talmud, which is in Israel, senses that there's a greater closeness between the people. And therefore, Vicky would be happier to commit herself and create a legal liability to repay the loan for somebody else, even though she did not get much in return. So in other words, in Babylon outside of Israel, the Jew is not going to commit to their fellow Jew unless they're getting something concrete. And the ability to get someone to write a check is concrete. You're moving money by your mouth. That's a concrete benefit. But tell the guy, in the language of the Talmud, the creditor is choking me, Menachem. The creditor is choking me, and Vicky says, "Let go," and the guy lets go. Who's that a benefit for? It's a benefit for me, but is that a benefit for Vicky? Babylonian Talmud says no. Jerusalem Talmud says yes. Why? Because in the Jerusalem Talmud, my pain is Vicky's pain. We're much more integrated. The pain of one Jew is the pain of somebody else. So when I was being oppressed, when I was being choked in the market, and the creditor says, pay up, and Vicky sees that I'm being choked, Vicky says, leave the guy alone. Leave him alone, and I'll pay him back. Who got a benefit? Not just me, but also Vicky. Because the integration of the people is much deeper. And we can read it inside and see how you see Talmudic statements that say that. But I think that when we're living together in one land of Israel, even today, we feel ourselves much more interconnected and a community. Outside of Israel, yes, our souls are interconnected, and that's why there's this concept of being a guarantor. Everyone's a built-in guarantor. So this is an interesting concept. Let's stop for a second. The law is like this. The law is you only make a blessing if you get a benefit. So for example, if you're eating bread, I cannot say the hamotzi for you. I can't thank God for the bread for you, because that's the category of blessings called birchot hanehenin, blessings of pleasure. So you're eating the bagel. How could I make the blessing? I'm not getting any benefit, right? So when it comes to the class of blessings that are for pleasure, the person getting the pleasure makes the blessings. Okay. What happens if you talk about a category of blessings for a mitzvah? So I go to shul on Rosh Hashanah, and I hear the shofar, and I heard the rabbi making the blessings for the shofar. I fulfill my commandment, no problem. Then I'm walking down the street, I'm walking home, and I have my shofar. And someone says, could you blow the shofar for me? And I say, sure. I say, could you please say the blessing? He says, I don't want to make the blessing. I don't know how to make the blessing. Now the question is, could I make the blessing for that person? Oh, so if that person is eating bread, I can't make the hamotzi for that person, because that person, I already had, I'm not getting any benefit. So the question is, I fulfilled my spiritual obligation to hear the shofar. That person did not. Could I make the blessing for him? The answer is yes. Why? Because if there's one Jew who did not fulfill his obligation, it's my problem. Why? Because we're talking about a spiritual concept, and that relates to the soul, and all souls are integrated. So if your soul didn't hear the shofar, my soul is not fully in pleasure. So the point here is we're all integrated, and therefore I feel your pain, and therefore you hear the shofar makes me happy. When you talk about something physical, we're separate. Your bagel doesn't satisfy me, because it's not a matter of the souls, it's a matter of the body. And therefore I cannot make a blessing for you when you have a physical pleasure. So now let's think about this. We're all integrated on a soul level, yes. But does that integration, how does that play out in the real world? How does that play out when we're in the real economy? So in Babylonia, you don't access the soul on that same level. So in Babylonia, me getting relief from my creditor is not really enough benefit for somebody else to say that's a consideration. That's something that they got in return, a tangible enough gift that would make them commit to receive that they're liable. But in Israel, even the economy is permeated with spirituality. In other words, even the physical interactions, we sense ourselves much closer to each other. And therefore, yes, when I have a benefit, it's possible that Vicky will commit herself for my benefit. Now, you can open up the media and see that in Israel, people are, at least the last couple of years, at least the last whatever, I don't want to, getting specific, but the bottom line is sometimes you see there's a lot of infighting. And you can make the mistake and you could think that there's no unity. But then you have moments of crisis and you realize how everybody is in the same page and everyone is closely together and so close knit. And the reason why they're fighting all the time is because they're so connected and so passionate, and it's the lack of indifference. And here you could be living outside of Israel and your neighbor, I'm not fighting with my neighbor because I'm indifferent about my neighbor. But when you're living together on one land and you're in the same economy and you're under the same external threats, and you're going to feel much more connected. And the other person's pain, you can get to the point where the other person's pain is your own pain. So this is an idea. We'll read it inside a little bit, but this is an idea how we think of each other in the spiritual sense, how that will affect the monetary law. So that's going back to Dr. Tamarin's question, which is it's not just law, but it's law permeated with the values of the Torah. But again, we understand that not always are we on the same level. There's Babylonia. There's the way the Jew is in Babylonia and the way the Jew is in Tel Aviv. It's not the same. It's not the same experience. It's not the same experience. When you're in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange, you're not the same person. You're not feeling the same thing. That's the pitch. That's the thing. So we can read it inside. We can elaborate. We can take questions. We can agree. We can disagree. But this is the thesis. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Well, it's a very valuable lesson, but I think we are one people, even outside of Israel, and we do feel connected.
We are, and we feel connected. The question is to what degree? To the degree that it's a question of degree. We're all connected. Our soul level, we're all connected. And how much we feel connected when we come to shul together and we say l'chaim, we feel connected. Do we feel connected when we're in doing business? Or is it much more, I have to worry about my assets, you worry about your... The question is, how much does that connection play out in the real economy? And there's a difference where you are. There's a difference where you are, because the place where you are affects how much your values will affect your doing business. Now, of course, this is generalization. You can have someone in Israel who feels very much connected, someone in Babylonia who feels very much connected to other people, and their pain is his pain. And you can have someone in Israel who's indifferent. Of course, we're generalizing. That's what law does. But if you have to make a general statement and you're going to say in Israel, people are much more interconnected and someone else's pain is much more my pain than in Babylonia. What's the ramification? Ramification is, are you obligated to be a guarantor by your word, even if what you get in return is very intangible? It's the other guy is not in pain. Okay, could that be classified as I'm not in pain? It was an old story. There's a very famous rabbi in Jerusalem. His name was Aryeh Levin. Without getting into his biography, a fascinating guy. And he said he would go to the doctor with his wife, because his wife was in pain. So the doctor says, "What's the problem?" And he said, "Our foot is hurting." Right? It's not her foot is hurting. Our foot is hurting. So the question is, could you be in the place where it's not his foot or her foot is hurting? It's our foot is hurting. So it may be in Jerusalem. Maybe that's a little easier. Go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
I just want to get back one more moment and ask you for your opinion. This seeming dissonance in Shas, where it's, one against the other and breaking the teeth and the arguing and the Hillel and Shammai, is this to guarantee that the right decision is being made, the most just decision is being made? Because that's what the flavor of my question was before. Is all this kind of internal dissonance in Shas a trip to the wilderness, or does it have, substantive meaning to it?
I wouldn't say, I don't think there's one answer. And the answer is certainly the latter. It's certainly not in the wilderness. It's certainly to get to the core and get to the truth. But if you have to define what the benefit is, I would say there is a benefit that the more that we discuss and the more we analyze, the more we get to the truth. There is a benefit of that, but I don't think that's the only benefit, because this is a case in point. When I learn about this concept, and I learn about the disagreement between Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmud, what's the takeaway? The takeaway is, there's one takeaway for the law. If I ever want to verbalize and say that I'm going to be a guarantor, post facto, in other words, once the loan was already created, when it's time to collect, I'll know whether or not my word is verbal or not. So there's a practical application. But in addition to the practical application, the exercise that I just experienced in the last 20 minutes tells me that when I go home, I'm going to be asking myself this question. I'm going to be saying, is someone else's pain my pain? Now, a stranger in the street is one level, but is my child's pain my pain? Is my spouse's pain my pain? Am I on this level? And maybe sometimes and there's a spectrum. I could move to Jerusalem or move to Babylonia. Now that's literal or figurative. Within my own space, I could be in a space of Jerusalem, and I could be a space in Babylonia. Maybe on Shabbat and the weekday is Israel and Babylonia, right? The point is, I understand now. Now I'm looking. Now when I look at the world, I have a frame of reference to say, where am I on this map? Where am I on the spectrum? So it's not just the legal question, which is important, but it's also the philosophical question and the psychological question and the emotional question of where am I on this spectrum of being integrated with the people I love and the people around me? How much of it is their problem and how much of it is my problem? And this, having this frame of reference, I think could change my life.
And so to finish it, sometimes there's just no right answer. All right. Okay.
Or I would say both answers are right. Maybe in the legal sense, that's what we're trying to get. Maybe we'll get back to it next week at the JLI. Maybe in the legal sense, there's the legal answer. But we say Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. Both these and these are the words of the living God, meaning both Shammai and Hillel have a point. Maybe in the narrow legal question of is Vicky liable for my loan? Maybe the narrow question, we do reach a result. We know when the Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud disagree, we follow the Babylonian for various reasons. Maybe we'll talk about it on Sunday. But the bottom line is, we know we have a practical answer. But the practical answer is only one dimension of the benefit of the study. The other benefit is both perspectives are true. Not none are true, both are true. Both have a point. And the question is, where am I on this spectrum? Where am I living? Am I living in Jerusalem or am I living in Babylonia? And that could be, and for different people, I'm not the same thing. Obviously the stranger is not going to be the same as my spouse or my child. But again, my child has a problem. She forgot her book. Is this my problem or is it her problem? Now, sometimes it should be her problem. It's not my problem. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your child is say it's your responsibility, and giving freedom is giving responsibility, and leave me alone. Don't call me. The big problem, once your kids, they learn your phone number, they don't stop, right? So I'm sure you experienced that. 3 years old, they start calling you not all day. So at some point you say, it's your problem, leave me alone. On the other hand, you have to be integrated. So my point is, but now we have a spectrum. Now we understand. Am I getting something tangible or am I not? Am I in Jerusalem or am I in Babylonia? Do I feel connected in a spiritual sense or do I feel connected also in the practical sense? Am I going to say l'chaim with you or am I also going to give you business advice? There's two separate questions. I'm going to study Torah with you or are we going to go boating together or swimming together? You understand what I'm saying? In other words, how much is our integration? What areas of our life does it permeate? And again, the answer for every person is different, and within your circle of relationships, you don't have the same answer because your spouse is not your stranger. But the point here is now we start thinking about these questions and say, how much am I integrated with the people around me? On the spiritual sense, we're very much integrated, but how much do I feel that spirituality?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Bob. Go ahead, Dr. John.
Rabbi, your comments about the relationship between circumstance, temporality, and the level of connectedness is no more true in marriage. Well, shall I say, marriage is a perfect example. When people meet and decide to get married, there's a high level of connection.
Right.
And 50% of those marriages end in divorce. There is no connection at all. So what I'm saying, which is sort of part of what you're saying, is that circumstance enormously varies the extent to which there is empathy or connection between the two parties.
Right, I agree. But what I'm adding is it's possible that in the same couple, some areas we're in Jerusalem and some areas we're in Babylonia, and it's not always the same. And sometimes sometimes the person is in pain, so I feel the pain. Sometimes it's an anniversary, but it's okay. It's okay. People are not computers. People move from Jerusalem to Babylonia. People fluctuate. The feelings never stay the same. This notion that the feelings are like a torch of fire. It goes up, it goes down. Don't be upset that right now I feel like I'm in Babylonia, which I'm still connected. If I get something, I give something. I'm still connected. But right now I don't feel that same connection as Jerusalem. It's okay. Maybe this afternoon you will feel it. So give yourself a break. You know what I mean? It's okay. But the point is, by seeing, there's a model here. And there's never no connection at all, because even in the law, certain areas you're always connected to the other person. You can make a blessing for them for a mitzvah, because spiritual matters, oh, for sure we're connected. Question is, how much do I feel it in the practical sense? So there's a spectrum, and it fluctuates, and that's okay. Right? So I think in marriage also, and in relationships with children or spouse, whatever it is, in all relationships, we have to be able to understand that it's not a question of what's right, what's the right right way or wrong way. It depends. It depends on the scenario. It depends what state of mind I am in. It depends what state of mind the other person is. It depends if we're busy. It depends if it's a holiday. It depends if we're in traffic. It depends if we're late to an appointment. It all depends, but that's okay. So that is I think we'll stop here. That's a little taste how even the monetary law is permeated with spiritual ideas and philosophical ideas, and how we, when we learn the Torah, there's on one hand, we have an eye on the practical, because it's very important to know what is the divine will in this scenario. And we even if the Talmud has debates, there are systems. In the post-Talmudic era, we can, with lesson 6 of the JLI, we'll get to that. There are systems of how to figure out and deduce the law. But then there's also the spirit of the law and the spirituality of the law and the philosophy of the law. And here we actually could learn from both opinions, because both opinions teach us something important about ourselves. So that's the pitch. Now we have, now God will bless us with many, many decades to continue studying and continue growing and continue applying in good health and in peace of mind.
Rabbi, may I ask you for a moment more, since it's 10:56?
Sure.
You raised last week, which I found absolutely fascinating. So often, I think people feel that the primary value in orthodoxy is adherence. And the point that you made, which I found fascinating, is you said no. The most important value is to keep asking questions behind questions behind questions. So my question is this: for the 4 kids on Passover who ask questions, who is more valued? The one who is dutiful, or the one who wants to probe more deeply?
So the most painful child, who's the most painful child? So the conventional interpretation is the quote unquote wicked child is the most painful child, right? He's wicked. He's asking provocative questions. Now, remember, wicked child is not the best translation. Wicked child is probably rebellious is probably a better translation in that context of Russia, even though Russia, because a general word, can mean many different things, but it's translated as wicked, probably rebellious. But we would think that's the most painful, but it's not. It's not. It's, first of all, he's the second child. He's next to the wise one. Asking a question, if you're asking a sophisticated question, even if it's rebellious, you're number 2. You're not number 4. What's number 4? What's the most painful? Most painful is the child who doesn't ask. And that's why the Torah uses the term at petach lo. And that's a problem, because at, not ata, is feminine. And the question is, why does it say you in the feminine open up his mouth? Meaning intrigue him. Get him to ask a question. So the traditional answer was because the father is in pain, he's weakened like a female, because the male is strong and the female is weak. And the father is pained not by the rebellious son, but by the son who doesn't ask. I think there's another answer, which is if you want to get the child to ask, you have to come with a feminine perspective, right? You have to come and nurture him to the point where he's curious enough to ask. But the point here is, you asked what's the most painful. The most painful is not the rebellious question. The most painful is the no question.
Well, Rabbi, one thing which you do here, which is remarkable, is you stimulate all of us, with a small group, frankly, it should be larger, but it is, to ask questions. And Bob, you know that an awful lot of lecturers who are given an hour lecture for 59 minutes, and they don't leave time for questions. So if they were truly committed, as the rabbi is, to the importance of questions, they should give a half an hour lecture and a half an hour for questions.
Bob, you decided you're on mute, Bob. You're on mute. We want to hear, but you're on mute.
Well, here we all have, all we have is answers to our question, because we all come here with our questions, whether we verbalize it or not, and you never fail to answer.
All we have is more questions.
I think the only answer that you didn't give it, which I see now, the upside of dissonance is to create community, is the idea that you can have a back and forth. I bet you that Hillel and Shammai were good buddies. I mean, there's something to be said about about the back and forth that creates a dynamic that that inspires community.
It's an incredible story. I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to say it. An incredible story about the Talmud. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, fascinating people. Without getting into the whole biographies, Reish Lakish, they would argue every single day about everything. Reish Lakish dies, so Rabbi Yochanan is in deep mourning. He's in terrible pain. So they said, okay, we got to find a smart guy to replace Reish Lakish and study with Rabbi Yochanan. So they find a smart guy. And this guy was so smart that everything Rabbi Yochanan would say, this guy would say, I have proof that you are correct. So Rabbi Yochanan was totally turned off. He says, what? This is who you're going to give me to replace Reish Lakish? Every statement I said, Reish Lakish asked 24 questions and attacked me 24 different ways. And by that discussion, we both came smarter. Now you're bringing someone to say that I'm right? Of course I know I'm right. He's not helping me, right? So that's the culture. Right. That's the culture that formed who we are as a people.
Well, thank you, Rabbi. We so appreciate our Friday get-togethers with you in a philosophic, questioning way. We can't thank you enough.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining. And this is, of course,
you are to stimulate
myself more than for you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. See you on Sunday.
God willing.
Yeah.
You will.